Chapter 1. The church bells of St. Mary Mead rang with an almost mischievous cheer that morning, cutting through the early spring mist, blanketing the village of Haythorpe. Beneath the spire, the congregation filed in with Sunday solemnity, their gloved hands brushing dew from their coats, their polite smiles exchanged like currency in a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, though seldom the truth of it. Inside, the wooden pews groaned softly as elderly parishioners took their places, and the scent of lavender polish clung to the air, mixed with the fading sweetness of daffodils from the altar. Miss Marple, sitting in her usual corner under the stained glass depiction of St. Agnes, quietly observed it all. She never missed morning service, not for religious fervour, but for the delicate theatre of village life that played out in the pauses between hymns and the awkward glances over shoulder blades. Today, something was askew. The choir had already begun tuning, their voices scaling half-heartedly, when a flurry of whispers began near the vestry door. Reverend Allerton, rosy-cheeked, well-meaning, and just a touch too fond of sherry, emerged flustered, holding an empty leather-bound hymnal in both hands, or rather, what should have been the church's ceremonial hymnal. Its pages were entirely gone. "Most curious," he muttered, his voice trailing off as he addressed the choir mistress. "Completely empty, every page torn out, and only this one gone. The rest are all intact." Mrs. Audrey Lembridge, choir mistress, a notorious stickler for order, looked scandalized. "Vandalism on the Sabbath?" She clutched her clipboard like a shield. "That hymnal has been in the church since Queen Victoria." There was a low hum of murmuring through the congregation. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes didn't leave the small scene unfolding at the front. Most found the matter amusing. Some even took it as a divine joke. But she had caught something odd in Mrs. Lembridge's reaction. Not the outrage, but the timing. Too sharp, too rehearsed. The service went on, a different hymnal used, the choir slightly off-key as they adjusted. But when Miss Marple left the church an hour later, she didn't head straight home. Instead, she wandered through the narrow path around the back of St. Mary Mead, past the moss-lined stones of the old graveyard, and paused by the compost bin near the garden wall. There it was, a shred of paper, old parchment, ink smudged, torn with haste. She retrieved it gently. The ink had run, but the line was visible. "He that hath ears to hear, let him hear." Miss Marple folded the scrap into her handbag without a word. That afternoon, the entire village buzzed about the missing hymnal. Some blamed the teens from the neighbouring town. Others muttered about ghosts. The vicar suggested mice. But no one, not even Miss Marple, voiced the underlying question: why only one hymnal? And why remove the pages but leave the cover? By Monday morning, Miss Marple was enjoying a simple breakfast of boiled egg and toast when her neighbour, Mrs. Petherick, dropped by unannounced. Her visits always signalled the arrival of some new gossip she could hardly contain. "You'll never believe it, Miss Marple. Audrey Lembridge fainted in the post office." Miss Marple raised a snowy eyebrow. "Fainted, you say?" Mrs. Petherick leaned forward, as though revealing the secrets of royalty. "Claimed it was low blood sugar, but Mr. Prentice swore she looked terrified, said her face was like chalk, and she muttered something about it being back again." "Very odd, don't you think?" "Most," Miss Marple said, gently stirring her tea. "And what exactly might it be? Well, she wouldn't say. Just clutched her handbag and refused smelling salts like they were arsenic. Miss Marple let the silence sit, let it bloom just long enough for Mrs. Petherick to fill it, and of course she did. You know, some say Audrey had a sister, Margaret, lovely soprano, years ago, disappeared suddenly, never spoken of, and Audrey, she never married after that. Miss Marple set her cup down with care. She had heard whispers of Margaret Lembridge long ago, but it had all faded into village legend, one of those tales children whispered to each other at dusk, a scandal buried beneath layers of polite forgetting. But Miss Marple had not forgotten. She yawned, rose slowly, and peered out the window towards St. Mary Mead, where the choir rehearsals were set to begin shortly. A church hymnal torn apart, a woman fainting, a decades-old disappearance no one wanted to talk about. Yes, something had come back to Haythorpe, something ugly, something old. And Miss Marple, though no one knew it yet, had already begun the investigation. Before moving next, Detective, where in the world are you solving mysteries with us? Drop your location in the comments. And if you crave more twisted tales, hit subscribe. Tomorrow's case file is even darker. Stay sharp. Chapter 2. The sun had risen higher over Haythorpe by Tuesday, brightening the village with deceptive warmth. The kind of warmth that made secrets seem silly and long-forgotten scandals safe. But the vicarage, nestled between ivy-draped hedges and flanked by tall laurel bushes, felt heavy despite the cheerful weather. Inside, Reverend Allerton paced in soft, deliberate steps. His office, usually cluttered with old sermons, errant library books, and unfinished crossword puzzles, was now unusually tidy. Even the calendar on the wall, still stuck on March 1938, had been adjusted. A quiet sense of order had settled in, as though tidiness could somehow shield him from scandal. Miss Marple arrived mid-morning, invited by the Reverend himself for a chat and cup of tea. She found him standing by the fireplace, his hand resting too long on the mantel before he turned to greet her. "My dear Miss Marple," he said, gesturing to the armchair opposite, I must admit, I'm in something of a muddle." "That," she replied gently as she sat, "is a perfectly respectable state to be in, provided one doesn't mistake it for clarity." The vicar gave a nervous chuckle, then poured her tea with a slightly trembling hand. "It's about the hymnal. You see, it's not just the vandalism, it's the implications. The Lembridge girl, Audrey, she's been rather high-strung of late. She fainted at the post office," Miss Marple said matter-of-factly, accepting the cup. His head jerked up. "Already gossip, is it?" "No more than usual," she replied, stirring her tea. "Though the timing seems more than coincidental. Tell me, Reverend, did you notice anything unusual in Audrey Lembridge's behavior before Sunday morning?" The vicar paused, eyes flicking toward the window. "She was here Thursday evening, rehearsing alone. She insisted the choir was underprepared, even though they've sung the Lent repertoire for years. I heard her playing the organ late. She was disturbed, distant. I assumed it was fatigue." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And the hymnal, was it accessible to anyone?" "Well, theoretically, yes. The ceremonial hymnal is kept in the sacristy cupboard. Locked, of course, but the key is, well, it's never moved, hanging by the crossbeam. Anyone who's helped with altar arrangements would know. So not locked at all, then, Miss Marple murmured, almost to herself. The Reverend had the grace to look embarrassed. Just then, a soft knock interrupted their conversation. A young woman, 20 at most, with wide brown eyes and slightly flushed cheeks, stood in the doorway holding a dusting cloth. "Oh, forgive me, I didn't know you had a guest, sir." "Quite all right, Janet," said the Reverend. "Miss Marple, this is Janet Farley, our new housemaid. She's been with us a fortnight." Janet gave a quick curtsy, her gaze flickering, to Miss Marple. "Sorry, miss." Miss Marple returned a kind smile. "No need at all. You weren't at Sunday service, I believe." Janet hesitated. "No, miss. I was nursing my aunt in Dedham. She's very old and she don't eat much." "The doctor says," Reverend Allerton cut in kindly. "She's a conscientious girl, Miss Marple. Always asks before taking leave." "I'm sure she is," said Miss Marple, still watching Janet's nervous hands fidget with the hem of her apron. "Would you happen to know if anyone else was near the vestry that evening? Thursday, perhaps?" Janet blinked, then glanced down. "Only Audrey Lembridge, miss. She was here a long while, arguing with someone outside the window. I heard raised voices while I was dusting the front pews." Miss Marple's teacup paused mid-air. "Could you tell who it was?" "No, miss." Man's voice, low. She kept saying, "Not again. I won't go through this again." Then the door slammed. Reverend Allerton looked startled. "She didn't mention anything about that to me." "No, sir," Janet replied softly. "Didn't seem like something she'd want remembered." Miss Marple set down her teacup. "Thank you, Janet. That's most helpful." The girl bobbed her head and disappeared. Miss Marple turned to the vicar. "It would seem Audrey Lembridge is not merely nervous, but frightened. And frightened people do strange things." That afternoon, Miss Marple visited the local grocer under the pretext of purchasing tinned pears. Mr. Quimby, the grocer, was already deep in discussion with Mrs. Hymnal, who had all the discretion of a kettle left to boil unattended. "And if you ask me," Mrs. Hymnal was saying, "it's just like her mother's disappearance. That Margaret Lembridge walked out one morning, never came back. Audrey was never the same after." "She was 12, Mr. Quimby said, handing Miss Marple her change. "And the mother didn't just vanish. There were rumours. Some said she ran off with a musician. Others said the river took her. Either way," Mrs. Hymnal sniffed, "too many disappearances in that family for my taste." Miss Marple left them to it, the weight of their words gathering behind her like smoke. Later that evening, as the choir rehearsed again at St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple stood just outside, half shielded by the yew hedge. She watched as Audrey Lembridge conducted the singers, her motions sharp, eyes flicking nervously towards the door. Every few minutes, from her coat pocket, Miss Marple took out the torn fragment of parchment found by the compost bin. The verse, "He that hath ears to hear, let him hear," lingered in her thoughts. Not a random passage, not a prank, a message. And Miss Marple, who knew the rhythms of guilt better than most, now sensed the faintest harmony of something buried, of grief, of fear, and of shame, long silenced. Something or someone had come back to Haythorpe, and someone else wanted it to stay forgotten. Chapter 3. Haythorpe had always been a place where a raised eyebrow could carry more weight than a shouted accusation. And so, the disappearance of a church hymnal and the rumours surrounding Audrey Lembridge's fainting fit had become the unspoken headline in every drawing-room and kitchen, never quite addressed outright, but always present in glances and unfinished sentences. Miss Marple, for her part, knew better than to confront the matter head-on. People, she often thought, were like teacups. Apply too much pressure, and they'd chip. But let them steep in silence long enough, and they'd reveal everything. Next stop was not a drawing-room, but the church garden, a modest patch of earth cared for by the ladies' auxiliary. She arrived just after noon, under the pretence of delivering a new pair of gloves to Miss Phelps, the gardening chairwoman, and a woman for whom order was less a preference and more a creed. Miss Phelps, kneeling by a row of white lilies, greeted her with a brisk nod. "I must say, I didn't expect a visit from you today, Jane." "I know," Miss Marple replied kindly, "but I was walking past and thought of you. These gloves, extra padding for the thumb, just as you like." Miss Phelps gave a satisfied noise, accepting the package. "Well, that's kind of you." Satisfied noise, accepting the package. "Well, that's kind of you." Miss Marple knelt carefully beside her, resting on the low stone border. "The lilies are thriving," she said gently, "and I hear the church choir is not." Miss Phelps's lips thinned. "Audrey Lembridge has grown erratic. She dismissed young Nora Buckley yesterday for disruptive eye contact. Said she blinked too much during the Ave Verum. Perhaps she's under stress. Humph. That woman has run the choir like a military unit for 20 years. It would take more than stress to shake her." Miss Marple plucked a weed from the soil. "Tell me, Miss Phelps, was Audrey close to her sister Margaret?" That stopped the gardening for a full 2 seconds. As close as girls can be when one vanishes in disgrace. Audrey never spoke of her. I only saw Margaret once. She had a voice that could make you forget your sins. Left with a visiting organist, they said. Some Italian. Audrey's never corrected the tale. No, but she's never confirmed it either. Which says more, if you ask me. Miss Marple stood brushing the earth from her skirt. "Thank you, dear. You've reminded me of something I hadn't thought of in years." As she turned to leave, a glint of paper caught her eye, just beneath the flowering lilies. Miss Phelps followed her gaze. "Rubbish from the wind, I expect," she muttered. But Miss Marple had already bent to retrieve it. A small square of notepaper, brittle with age. On it, in delicate penmanship, were the words, "Forgive me. I cannot stay where her voice still lingers." There was no name, just a faint smudge of something, wax perhaps, near the bottom edge. Miss Marple folded it carefully. "You know, Miss Phelps, rubbish is often more revealing than it appears." That evening, as twilight fell over the rooftops of Haythorpe, Miss Marple returned to her sitting-room with a quiet sense of unease. She placed the note beside the parchment from the compost bin. The messages didn't match in handwriting, nor in tone, but both felt unmistakably personal, emotional. Miss Marple didn't believe in coincidence, not in villages. A ceremonial hymnal was torn apart on a Sunday. Audrey Lembridge grew pale at the mention of its return. And now, this second note, buried beneath lilies planted just last spring. She took out a small notebook from her side table, and with her usual neat script, began a new page. Known facts, hymnal pages removed, only one volume targeted verse found in compost bin. He that hath ears to hear. Audrey Lembridge fainted in post office. Said it's back again. Note found in church garden. I cannot stay where her voice still lingers. Margaret Lembridge disappeared decades ago. Never mentioned by Audrey Choir, discontent growing. Nora Buckley dismissed Miss Marple, paused, then wrote one more line beneath. This is not about vandalism. It is about remembrance, or perhaps refusal to forget. The next morning, Miss Marple made her way to Buckley's Butcher, an establishment known more for gossip than gammon. Inside, Nora Buckley herself stood behind the counter, tying string around a parcel of kidneys. She was 17, all freckles and ferocity. Miss Marple, she said with some surprise. We've no chicken in yet, but I can check. No, thank you, dear. I came to ask about the choir. You were recently removed, I hear. Nora flushed but nodded. She said I was unsettling the harmony. Which is nonsense. She's just frightened, Miss Marple, of something no one else sees. Go on, Miss Marple encouraged, her tone gentle. I came in early last week, me and Thomas Gray. We were moving the music stands, and we heard her in the vestry, crying, not sobbing, just whispering someone's name over and over. Miss Marple tilted her head. What name? I couldn't be sure, Nora admitted, but it sounded like Margaret. As Miss Marple stepped into the pale morning light once more, her eyes followed the steeple of St. Mary Mead as it pierced the sky. A hymnal was stolen, but a memory, unwanted, unburied, was what had truly returned. And Miss Marple, who understood far more about grief than she let on, felt the weight of it beginning to settle. This was no mere churchyard mystery. It was a reckoning. Chapter 4. By Wednesday afternoon, the village of Haythorpe had collectively decided who to blame. Not through evidence or admission, of course, but through that curious village instinct, the need for neatness. And what was neater than blaming someone from outside? Thomas Gray. He was 17, broad-shouldered, with an unfortunate tendency to wear his shirt sleeves too short. A delivery boy for Buckley's Butcher, he was also known for fiddling with the church organ when no one was watching. Quiet, awkward, and in possession of a fondness for poetry he never shared, Thomas had become a convenient scapegoat. "It's the sort of thing boys do," declared Mr. Quimby at the bakery queue. "Sneaking in, tearing up books, scaring the old choir mistress, mark my words. He wanted attention." By tea-time, the theory had matured. He fancied Audrey's niece, muttered Mrs. Hartnell behind her fan at the bridge club, and when she turned him down, well, revenge. Miss Marple, knitting calmly near the fire at the vicarage, allowed the talk to continue without interruption. She knew better than to interrupt a good rumour. It bloomed faster when unpruned. Across from her, Reverend Allerton wrung his hands. "I don't believe Thomas would do such a thing. He may be unusual, but vandalism, no." Miss Marple set down her knitting. "Unusual boys are often the first to be blamed. It saves others the discomfort of looking inward." The vicar gave her a grateful smile. "He's here now, actually. I asked him to help clear the sacristy shelves. He's surprisingly gentle with fragile things." "May I speak with him?" The vicar hesitated, then nodded. "He respects you. I think he'll talk. He respects you. I think he'll talk. Miss Marple found Thomas crouched beside a crate of candle holders, wiping the brass with uncharacteristic care. He looked up with a nervous smile. "Afternoon, Miss Marple." "Afternoon, Thomas. I hope I'm not interrupting." He shrugged. "Not really. Better than carrying liver." She smiled faintly. "Tell me, dear, did you hear what people are saying?" He froze. "About the hymnal?" She nodded. "They think I tore it up." His voice barely rose above a whisper. "I didn't. I wouldn't. I believe you," Miss Marple said simply. That surprised him. His eyes softened. "Nora said you might." "I understand boys," she said, "especially ones who are curious rather than cruel." Thomas exhaled, almost as if he'd been holding his breath for days. "I was in the church that Thursday. Audrey asked me to carry some hymnals. I stayed after. The organ was open. I played a little." Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. "Did you see anything unusual?" He hesitated. "Audrey was there, arguing with someone. I didn't want to eavesdrop, so I went around to the back. But as I passed the garden, I heard someone crying." "Crying?" Thomas nodded. "Not loud, just soft, like they were trying not to be heard. I thought maybe it was her, but the voice was lower. A man's, maybe." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a torn corner of faded sheet music. "I found this near the compost bin. Didn't think much of it, but, well." Miss Marple accepted it gently. The title was torn away, but she recognized the scribbled musical notes. The same hand as the parchment she had found. Not vandalism, not a prank, a pattern. "Did you see anyone else?" He shook his head. "Just Janet. She was sweeping near the garden wall." Miss Marple's brow furrowed. "Janet, again. Always just near the edges. Thank you, Thomas. You've been most helpful." She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "Miss Marple, do you think someone died?" She turned back. "Not recently," she said quietly. "But something did. Something important. And someone is still grieving it." That evening the police arrived. Inspector Crail was from Downham and had a jaw like a bulldog and the patience of a terrier. He sat in the vestry while Audrey Lembridge paced before him, arms crossed, chin lifted too high. "I've told you everything," she snapped. "This is ridiculous." "And yet," Crail said, flipping open his notepad, "we have conflicting accounts of your whereabouts and several items of concern. Missing pages, unexplained visitors, emotional outbursts. You fainted, Miss Lembridge." "I was ill," said. "It's back again." "Care to elaborate?" Miss Marple, seated quietly by the stained glass window, watched Audrey's lips part, and then close again. A pause. The first real hesitation. "I don't recall saying that." Crail narrowed his eyes. "Do you recall who you argued with on Thursday evening?" Another pause. Then, "No one." The lie settled awkwardly in the room, thick and obvious. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "Forgive me, Audrey, but was it Margaret?" The choir mistress stiffened. Her entire posture changed. Not crumpling, not fleeing, but coiling, like a spring pulled too tight. "I haven't spoken that name in 20 years. "That," Miss Marple said, "is rather the point." As the vicar saw the inspector out, Miss Marple remained seated. Audrey stood by the organ, arms at her sides, suddenly frail beneath the light of the stained glass. "Margaret loved music," she said, barely audible, "more than she loved us, more than she loved me." Miss Marple rose and approached gently, and she vanished. "She chose to leave," Audrey said. "She wasn't taken. She chose." Miss Marple studied her face. "That's what you tell everyone, but not yourself." Audrey turned sharply. "What do you mean?" "I mean," said Miss Marple softly, "that no one tears apart a hymnal out of spite. They do it to destroy a memory." And in Audrey's silence, Miss Marple knew the hymnal hadn't been stolen. It had been buried. Chapter 5. Miss Marple had always believed that the truth was rarely hidden in darkness. It simply nestled in plain sight, overlooked by those searching for shadows. The village of Haythorpe, with its neat hedgerows and tidy habits, excelled at such oversights. And now, as the mystery of the hymnal and Margaret Lembridge's long ago vanishing began to twist into something far more personal, Miss Marple returned to the church one quiet Thursday morning with a very specific intention. She had asked for the hymnal cover, the one left behind, emptied of all its pages. Reverend Allerton had obliged, albeit reluctantly, and now she sat in the chancel with the ruined object resting on her lap like a wounded thing. The leather binding was cracked with age, but intact. The clasp still functioned, though loosely. What intrigued her most was not the missing pages, but what had replaced them. She angled the binding toward the morning light streaming through the nave windows. There, in the gutter between the inner spine and the cover lining, was the faintest trace of wax. Not wax from a candle. It was darker, tinged with red, sealing wax. She fetched her magnifying glass from her handbag and peered closer. Yes, indeed, not merely a fragment, an impression. A crest, perhaps. A small, shallow sigil almost lost to time. And around it, a subtle scent. Not mould, something sharper. Miss Marple's nose twitched. Myrrh, she whispered to herself. Or, no, perfume, very old. She folded the hymnal closed with care and slipped it into her satchel. This was no case of vandalism. Someone had placed something in that hymnal, a sealed item, and then removed it, not to destroy, but to retrieve. And that begged the question, what had been hidden there for decades? Later that day, she visited Janet Farley at the vicarage once more. The young housemaid had grown noticeably quieter over the past few days. Jumpy, as though waiting for something to catch up to her. Miss Marple caught her just as she was polishing the hallway banister. "Janet, dear," she said kindly, "I've brought some balm for your hands. All that wood polish. Very drying, I imagine." "Oh," Janet blinked, clearly surprised. "Thank you, miss. That's kind of you." Miss Marple handed over the small tin. "Just a quick question while I have you. Did you ever clean the choir loft before Sunday morning?" Janet hesitated, eyes flicking left. "No, miss, only the pews. I'm not allowed near the loft. Miss Lembridge said so." "She said so recently?" "Yes, miss. Just last week. Said it wasn't necessary." Miss Marple offered a warm smile and let the silence sit. Janet broke first, but "I did go up once. I had to fetch a broom someone left behind. There was something strange." "Strange?" "A drawer in the organ bench was open. There was a letter inside, old-looking, smelled sweet like perfume. I didn't read it, just closed the drawer." And when was this? The Thursday before it all started. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Thank you, dear. You've been most helpful. She left the vicarage in a quiet swirl of thought. The letter, the perfume, the sealed hymnal. There was something linking these relics, something left behind that someone had wanted to stay buried, and someone else had just remembered it. Miss Marple didn't go home. Instead, she walked back to the church. The doors creaked as she entered, the scent of old wood and brass polish clinging to the air. No one was present. She climbed the narrow spiral staircase to the choir loft. Dust moted in the shafts of light, undisturbed. The bench beside the organ stood innocently in place. She opened the drawer, empty. But the wood retained a faint floral scent, like rosewater tinged with something darker. She sat on the bench and closed her eyes. Margaret Lembridge had once sung from this spot. Her voice, by all accounts, had been unforgettable. She had disappeared. No body, no note, only silence, replaced by rumours and shame. And someone had hidden something here. A letter, perhaps. A confession. Maybe more. Miss Marple reached down and pressed lightly along the inner edge of the drawer. Her fingers brushed something irregular. She withdrew a sliver of wax, dried, old, half-melted. It bore the same crest from the hymnal binding. That evening, Miss Marple paid a visit to the oldest woman in Haythorpe, Mrs. Edna Drayton, once Theosis Dobgir, postmistress, now near blind and near 90, and rarely seen outside her lace-curtained cottage. "You'll think I'm losing my marbles," Edna said with a wry grin. "But I remember the day Margaret vanished. I remember it because a letter was posted the very next day. No address, no stamp, just a name, M.L. The vicar at the time had me deliver it straight to Audrey." "A sealed letter?" asked Miss Marple. "With red wax," Edna said, "and perfume. I thought it was a love letter. But Audrey went white as a sheet when she opened it, refused to speak of it ever again." Miss Marple smiled softly. It wasn't a love letter. It was a confession. As she stepped out into the night air, Miss Marple no longer doubted the direction the case was taking. The hymnal had once held more than hymns. It had held a truth that someone had tried to hide. Someone had waited years for a memory to fade. But the past, like an old melody, has a way of returning, softly at first. Then, with force, someone had unsealed that truth, and someone else was desperate to bury it all over again. Chapter 6. By Friday morning, the village's polite veil had begun to fray. It started with a notice on the parish board. Choir rehearsal postponed indefinitely, by order of Miss Lembridge. That alone might have been enough to spark unease. But coupled with the sudden resignation of Janet Farley from the vicarage, and a brief visit by Inspector Crail to the grocer's back room, speculation turned combustible. The vicar, despite his best efforts to appear unaffected, looked 10 years older in the space of a week. Even Mr. Quimby, usually the first to stoke the fires of gossip, had grown quieter, as though unsure where the truth now sat. And truth, as Miss Marple knew, was not merely hiding. It was being smothered. She sat in her parlour. The window cracked, just enough to hear the rattle of bicycle wheels and the chatter of passing schoolboys. On the table before her lay 3 items: the wax-stained binding of the stolen hymnal a sliver of melted red seal. A pressed white lily, faded but unmistakably from the church garden. Miss Marple had pressed it between pages 2 nights ago, after retrieving it from the same bed where the note had been found. Something had drawn her back there, something instinctual, and while she hadn't unearthed another message, the lily itself told a story. Lilies were planted last year, but one bore a scar at the stem, healed but visible, a small slice like from a dull blade. Someone had tried to cut it, or hide something near it. She tapped a finger gently on the desk. Margaret Lembridge had vanished. Audrey Lembridge had never left the choir. A letter had been sealed, hidden in a hymnal, and recently retrieved. And Janet Farley, the timid maid who never asked questions, had left the vicarage without collecting her final wages. Miss Marple rose, retrieved her gloves, and set out toward the far end of the village, where the older cottages pressed up against the boundary lane. She found Janet at her aunt's small home, where 3 chickens pecked aimlessly at dry earth and a cracked watering can leaned against the step. Janet opened the door slowly, eyes wide, eyes wide. "Miss Marple." "Don't worry, dear," she said gently. "I've come for tea, not interrogation." Janet hesitated, then let her in. The cottage was modest, tidy, and carried the heavy air of shared silence. Miss Marple waited until they were seated before speaking. "You left very suddenly." Janet kept her hands in her lap. "It didn't feel right there any more." "No, I imagine it didn't." Miss Marple studied her carefully. "You saw something, didn't you? Something that changed how you looked at Audrey Lembridge." Janet's eyes flicked up. I don't know what I saw." "Then describe it," Miss Marple said gently, "and we'll decide together." A long pause. After choir practice, Janet whispered, "Last week, I returned to get the broom. I thought everyone had gone, but Miss Lembridge was still in the vestry." June swallowed. She had the hymnal, the old one. She was holding it like it was something alive. And then she burned something in the sacristy fireplace, a paper or letters. Was she alone? Janet hesitated. "No, there was a man. I only saw his back, grey coat, balding. He handed her something before he left. She didn't see me. I ran." "Do you know who he was?" Janet shook her head. "But he walked with a limp." Miss Marple leaned back, eyes narrowed. A limp. She had seen that limp. Not in a stranger, but in someone long familiar. Someone whose name never entered the gossip, but whose presence lingered like wallpaper. Mr. Willoughby, the church organ tuner, a quiet man, soft-spoken, visited once a month, sat in the back pew during services, never married, lived just outside the village near the mill road, and walked with a slight but unmistakable drag of the left leg. He had been Margaret's tutor once, before the disappearance, and Audrey had never mentioned him. Miss Marple's next stop was the mill road. The cottage was barely visible behind overgrown hedges. When she knocked, it was several moments before the door creaked open. Mr. Willoughby blinked at her behind thick spectacles. "Miss Marple, this is a surprise." "I hope I'm not disturbing," she said sweetly. "I was hoping for your expertise. I've been examining a damaged hymnal." He gestured her inside. Of course. Sitting room smelled of cedar and old books. A single photo rested on the mantel, a younger Willoughby standing beside a piano, with a girl not quite facing the camera. Miss Marple stepped closer. She was gifted, wasn't she? She asked. He nodded slowly. More than gifted, Margaret was luminous. She vanished, but you already know that. He didn't speak. Miss Marple continued, soft but steady. And you were the last person seen with her before she disappeared. Not by police, but by the vicar, who said nothing. He felt sorry for Audrey. Willoughby sat suddenly pale. I didn't harm her. No, but you loved her, and you helped her run. His hand trembled. She was pregnant. The father refused to acknowledge it. Margaret couldn't bear the shame. Audrey begged me to stop her, but I gave her the fare, told her to go to London. Did she? I don't know. A letter came weeks later. I gave it to Audrey, sealed. I never read it. She hid it, Willoughby nodded, and tried to forget. But the past doesn't stay buried, Miss Marple finished. As she left the cottage, dusk settling over Haythorpe, Miss Marple felt the threads tightening. This was no longer a question of theft. It was a resurfacing. And somewhere beneath it all, someone was trying to rewrite the past before the truth claimed them. Chapter 7. By Saturday morning, the quiet of Haythorpe had taken on a brittle edge. The village moved slower, eyes darting across hedges and shop windows, tongues hesitant to speak what every heart suspected. That Margaret Lembridge's ghost had returned, not as a spectre, but as a question, and that questions, when left unanswered long enough, sometimes forced their own reply. It was Reverend Allerton who found the second scene. He had gone to St. Mary Mead early, intending to prepare the Sunday sermon, but when he opened the vestry door, the chill inside stopped him cold, not because of the temperature, but because of the figure slumped in the front pew. Audrey Lembridge, alive, but barely conscious. The vicar's voice echoed sharply as he called for help, and within 10 minutes Dr. Fossey had arrived with his black bag and grave face. Opium, he said, examining the scene with clinical precision. Tincture, a heavy dose. Suicide attempt? Asked Inspector Crail, summoned moments later. Fossey hesitated. Not a lethal amount, but intentional. She didn't want to die. She wanted silence. Crail turned toward Miss Marple, who stood just behind the doorway, gloved hands neatly folded. Your thoughts, Miss Marple? She stepped forward slowly, her gaze never leaving Audrey's unconscious figure. This was not a confession. This was a retreat. Someone has pushed her, forced her hand, not with violence, but with memory. Crail frowned. Still sounds like guilt to me. Or fear, Miss Marple murmured. Not of the law, but of what the truth might demand her to reveal. That evening, Audrey remained under observation in her home, sedated but stable. The village speculated in cautious whispers. Was it despair over the Hymnal scandal? A long-lost lover's return? The ghost of her sister? But Miss Marple was not speculating. She was listening, and the one voice that had been too quiet, too absent, was that of the original vicar. The one who had officiated Margaret Lembridge's choir days, who had received the sealed letter Edna Drayton mentioned, and who had remained in Haythorpe long after his retirement, Reverend Tobias March, now lived in a converted rectory just beyond the railway crossing, a man of 83, nearly deaf in one ear, and with a remarkable memory for things no one else wished to recall. Miss Marple visited him at twilight, beneath the sky streaked with lavender and soot. He met her at the door in a cardigan too, large for his thin frame, and greeted her with a warm, "Jane Marple, come to unearth more bones." She smiled politely. "Just to ask about one already dug up." They sat near the hearth, a pot of weak tea between them. "You were the vicar when Margaret Lembridge disappeared," she began. He nodded, expression unreadable. "She was pregnant," Miss Marple continued. "Mr. Willoughby told me as much." Tobias sighed. "She was a firework, that girl. She could lift hearts with a single note, and she was foolish, but not cruel." "You received a letter?" "I did." He looked into the fire. "Sealed in red wax. I never opened it. It wasn't mine to read, but I remember her face the day she left." "Did she say goodbye?" He nodded. "To me, yes. Not to her sister. She didn't dare. She only asked me one thing." "What was that?" "That if anything happened to her, I was to destroy the letter before Audrey could." Miss Marple stilled. "But you didn't." "I couldn't. I left it in the hymnal, the ceremonial one. I thought, if the truth ever needed to be known, it would survive long enough to find the right eyes." Miss Marple exhaled. "And now it has." She returned home and reviewed her notes beneath the soft glow of her sitting-room lamp. The pattern was becoming clearer. Margaret left with Willoughby's help, pregnant and ashamed. A letter followed, perhaps with news, perhaps a final goodbye. Audrey buried it in the hymnal, then buried her memory of Margaret. Someone found the letter. Audrey was confronted, and instead of confessing, she tried to silence herself. But who retrieved the letter? It wasn't Willoughby. He hadn't read it. It wasn't Janet. She only saw it. Then who had been close enough, unnoticed long enough, to find it in time? Knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Nora Buckley stood on the step, eyes wide, breath short. "Miss Marple," she said, "it's Thomas." Miss Marple's heart skipped. "He's gone," Nora said. "Disappeared. Left his bicycle outside the church. But no one's seen him since lunch." Chapter 8. The sky over Haythorpe had darkened quickly, clouds rolling in as if summoned by the village's collective unease. The search for Thomas Gray had begun in earnest by nightfall. Several villagers fanned out with lanterns, calling his name through gardens, hedgerows, and muddy paths. But Miss Marple did not join them. She already knew where he was. She merely needed to draw the truth into the open, and for that she required the right audience. By Sunday morning, the vicarage had filled with quiet dread. Audrey Lembridge, pale but upright, had returned to her rooms with the help of a nurse. Her attempted overdose was being framed as an unfortunate illness, and the village was too polite or too frightened to challenge the narrative. Miss Marple, however, had no such reservations. She requested a gathering, not in the church, not in anyone's drawing-room, but in the choir loft. It was unusual enough to provoke curiosity. She sent notes to those who mattered: Reverend Allerton, Inspector Crail, Mr. Willoughby, Nora Buckley, and most of all, Audrey Lembridge. To her, Miss Marple had written only a single sentence. There is something you once heard, which I believe you have tried very hard to forget. By noon, the loft had gathered its peculiar congregation. The space felt too small for what it contained. Suspicion, grief, fear. Audrey sat stiffly beside the organ, a shawl around her shoulders. Mr. Willoughby remained near the rail, quiet as always. The inspector, impatient and sceptical, leaned near the back. Miss Marple stood near the choir bench, a single piece of sheet music in her hands. "Thank you for coming," she said gently. "I realize this is most irregular, but then so is the truth we've been chasing." She turned to Audrey. "You were not the only one who visited the church on Thursday night. Thomas Gray was here. He was near the loft. He heard something, perhaps more than he was meant to." Audrey's mouth tightened, but she said nothing. Miss Marple continued, "And now he's missing. But he is not far. I have no fear for his safety. He is hiding because he believes he's done something terribly wrong." Gasps murmured through the group. "He saw someone," Miss Marple said, stepping to the organ. "He saw someone take something from this drawer, an old letter, one that had rested here, hidden in the bench for years." She opened the drawer. Empty, of course, but the faint scent of rose and ink lingered. Then she turned sharply to Mr. Willoughby. "You never read the letter you were given, but someone else did. Someone who had reason to fear what it contained, not because of what Margaret did, but because of what Margaret knew." Willoughby blinked. "Margaret, she only told me she was leaving, nothing else." "Precisely," said Miss Marple. "But the letter, when she posted it later, likely contained more, a name, a warning." She walked slowly now, letting her voice lower just slightly. "I believe the letter said what Margaret had recently discovered, that someone in the choir, someone close, was not who they claimed to be." She stopped before Audrey. "You have carried this pain for decades, Miss Lembridge. Not because of what you did, but because of what you allowed to happen." Audrey stood slowly. "I protected her." "You silenced her," Miss Marple said, softly but firmly, "because someone convinced you that her shame would ruin everything." Audrey's composure cracked. Her voice trembled. I didn't know she was pregnant. Not at first. I found out later. The letter said she was going to the coast to have the child in secret. She wanted to return someday. She said she'd forgiven me." A long, aching silence followed. Inspector Crail leaned forward. "Forgiven you for what?" Audrey didn't answer, but Miss Marple did. For keeping her secret from the police, for telling everyone she'd run away with a man, and for burning the second letter when she wrote again. Audrey bowed her head. "I was afraid. I didn't know what to do. The vicar had hidden the first letter in the hymnal. I told him it was better that way. But she wrote again, and I destroyed it." "Because it named someone," Miss Marple said. Audrey looked up, startled. "How could you know that?" Miss Marple's gaze was already on Nora Buckley. "I'm afraid the answer lies with you, Nora." Nora blinked. "Me? You've been present in more moments than anyone noticed. You found the second letter, didn't you? You said you saw Audrey crying, but you never said where. It was in the vestry. You arrived early. You saw the fire. You found what hadn't burned." Miss Marple turned to the group. Thomas Gray is not missing. He's been hiding because Nora told him he was in danger, that Audrey would blame him. But it wasn't Audrey who frightened Thomas. She looked again at Nora. It was you. Nora's eyes flashed wide. That's absurd. I think not, Miss Marple said calmly. Margaret Lembridge's second letter never reached the police, but someone read it. And that person panicked because Margaret knew about them, knew what they'd done. Perhaps she overheard something. Perhaps she witnessed something long ago. She paused. And you, Nora, are not 17. You're 19. You forged your school documents to appear younger. You came to Haythorpe 2 years ago, not 1. And Margaret Lembridge was your mother. A silence like falling snow filled the loft. Nora took a step back, lip trembling. She left you in care, Miss Marple said softly, likely born under a false name. But the resemblance, it's there. You found her name in the church records. You came looking. Nora's voice cracked. I didn't mean for any of this. I just wanted to know who I was. But when I found the letter, when I realized what Audrey had done, I couldn't stand it. She let her vanish. She let her be forgotten. Miss Marple stepped forward. And Thomas? I panicked. I told him Audrey was dangerous. I thought he'd keep quiet. He promised. But then he said he wanted to talk to the vicar. So I begged him to hide, just for a while. Miss Marple nodded gently. You didn't hurt him. No, Nora whispered. But I almost let him take the blame. Crail stepped forward, his expression unreadable. We'll need to speak further, Miss Buckley. Nora nodded, her face pale with the weight of what she had done. Later that evening, Miss Marple stood alone in the empty church, one hand resting on the edge of the choir bench. Some sins fade, others are inherited, and sometimes the past returns, not to haunt, but to be heard. Chapter 9. Sunday evening descended upon Haythorpe like a held breath. The bells of St. Mary Mead did not ring. The choir loft stood empty, and across the village no one spoke too loudly, as if sound itself might disturb the fragile balance now hanging in the air. At the vicarage, Reverend Allerton stood beside Miss Marple in the sitting-room, holding the letter they had recovered. Its ink faded, the seal long broken. He had not wanted to read it, not at first, but Miss Marple had insisted. Some truths, she'd said, are not burdens. They are lanterns. Dim, perhaps, but illuminating enough to set others free. The letter, penned in a delicate looping hand, was dated nearly 20 years prior. Margaret Lembridge's final words to her sister were heartbreakingly calm. I forgive you, Audrey. I know why you said the things you said. You feared shame, and you feared losing your place in the world. But what I carry now is not shame. It is a life. If anything should happen to me, know this. I left because I loved you too much to stay and be your scandal, and beware the man who listens from the shadows. He heard more than he should, and if ever he returns, you must speak. Truth, Audrey, is all we ever own. There was no signature, only the initials, M.L. The next day Thomas Gray was found at the old mill pond, tired, cold, but safe. Nora Buckley had told him to wait there, just for a few days, until things calmed down. Miss Marple suspected she had half believed. Her own plan would unravel before anyone noticed. But Haythorpe, for all its customs and quiet, had a way of noticing everything, eventually. Inspector Crail issued no formal charges. Nora was questioned, yes, but it was determined that her actions, though manipulative, had not crossed into criminality. The real damage had already been done decades ago, and the village, curiously, preferred not to see a second Lembridge girl carried off in disgrace. Instead, Nora left. One bag, one train ticket. No goodbyes. Reverend Allerton paid for her fare himself. She needed an exit, he said to Miss Marple afterward, standing outside the station. Not punishment, just a door. Miss Marple had simply nodded. Sometimes a village can survive only by pretending to forget. 2 days later, Audrey Lembridge came to tea. She did not ask for sugar. She did not bring her knitting. She sat in silence for 10 minutes before speaking. "I have decided to resign from the choir." Miss Marple stirred her tea gently. "A wise decision." "She was my sister," Audrey said, "but I envied her. She was beautiful. She sang like sunlight. And when she told me the truth, that she'd fallen in love, that she was pregnant, I felt only betrayal, as if she'd tarnished the very thing that made her special." "You were young," Miss Marple said. "And proud," Audrey replied. "Proud," Audrey replied. "When she left, I lied. To myself. To everyone. And when her second letter came, I destroyed it. I thought I was protecting her." "No," Miss Marple said softly. "You were protecting yourself." Audrey said nothing, but the admission had already landed. That evening, the vicar gathered the congregation for an informal service. No hymns were sung, no sermon delivered, only a reading from Ecclesiastes. To everything there is a season, a time to be silent and a time to speak. Miss Marple remained seated in the rear pew, watching as the faces turned toward the altar. Older now, humbled. A village cracked open, not shattered. And when the lights dimmed and the church emptied, she lingered. She walked once more to the choir loft, where the drawer had once held the letter. She placed something inside, not a note, but a pressed white lily. Then she closed it. For good. Chapter 10. On Monday morning, the village of Haythorpe returned to its routines. Bakers baking, gardeners trimming, and the postman whistling through the fog. But something had shifted beneath the surface. A kind of quiet acceptance now settled over the cobbled lanes and crooked fences. The scandal had passed, or more truthfully, it had been folded up, placed back on the shelf of village history, where all unsettling things eventually went. But for Miss Marple, there was still one thing left to do. The vicar, Reverend Allerton, had asked her to join him in the rectory garden, less formal than his study, and more forgiving of uncomfortable conversations. They sat under the elm, cups of tea in hand, the early spring wind nudging blossoms from the branches above. "She's not coming back, is she?" he asked after a long pause. "Nora," Miss Marple replied. "No, she has no reason to. Her questions have been answered, painfully perhaps, but truthfully." The vicar nodded. "And Thomas?" "He's resilient. He'll need time. But he's not broken. He saw the best and worst of people this week and came away intact." Reverend Allerton swirled the tea in his cup. "And Audrey?" Miss Marple's voice softened. She'll grieve now, properly, not for Margaret alone, but for the self she buried with her. The vicar looked down. I keep wondering why now? Why did this come to light after so many years? Miss Marple folded her hands neatly. Because someone opened a drawer. He blinked. It's not always something grand, she explained. The solving of a mystery often begins with something mundane. A drawer left ajar, a flower out of place. But in this case, it was a sequence, a progression no one meant to start. She counted them softly on her fingers. First, Audrey's growing instability, pressing the choir, lashing out. Then Thomas's curiosity. The boy adored that organ, and his innocence led him places no one else dared linger. Janet saw more than she admitted, and Nora, driven by blood and longing, discovered the final truth. She paused. But it was Margaret's voice, in the end, that broke through. That's what a hymn is, isn't it? A voice that lingers after the singer is gone. Reverend Allerton said nothing for a while. Then quietly, "You believe Margaret's letter was meant to be found? I believe she left it to protect Audrey," Miss Marple replied. She knew her sister's pride, her fear. She knew that guilt, like a weed, grows best in silence. She wanted her to confront the truth some day, not for punishment, for peace. He sat back, nodding slowly. You see things no one else sees. Miss Marple smiled faintly. I simply watch what others overlook. That afternoon, Inspector Crail paid a final visit. He met Miss Marple in her sitting room, where a pot of tea and a tin of biscuits awaited. He declined both, as usual. No charges, he said. Nora's gone, and Audrey. Well, there's no crime in grief. The boy's fine. The only thing officially damaged is a hymnal. And even that, Miss Marple murmured, revealed more truth than it ever held in music. Crail allowed himself the briefest smile. You make it sound poetic. Poetry and pain often share a rhythm, she replied. He stood adjusting his coat. There's one thing I still don't understand. Why did Audrey tear the hymnal apart now, after all this time? Miss Marple looked out the window, where wind pressed against the hedges, because she sensed it returning. Margaret's voice, Nora's presence, the whispering from the garden. A memory she'd kept locked for years had begun to rattle the hinges. She thought destroying the hymnal might destroy the guilt it held. But guilt is a seed, Inspector, and it grows best when buried. That evening, Miss Marple returned once more to St. Mary Mead. The church was empty, lit only by the soft glow of candlelight. She walked slowly past the pews, through the chancel, and up to the choir loft. Everything was as it had been, quiet, still, haunted only by the memory of music. She opened the bench drawer one final time. Inside lay her lily, now brittle and flattened but intact. She placed one last item beside it, a single torn page from the hymnal. Recovered, carefully pressed, the ink faded but legible. Let not your heart be troubled. She closed the drawer, not to hide, but to honor. Chapter 11. By Tuesday, the weather had turned. Rain swept through Haythorpe in fitful gusts, washing the last of the blossoms from the trees and soaking the village green until the paths turned to mud. The countryside seemed to sigh, as if even the sky had exhaled after the storm of revelations. But not everyone in Haythorpe found peace in the rain. Audrey Lembridge had not left her house since the gathering in the choir loft. Though no charges were laid, and though Miss Marple had spoken to her gently, without scolding, without judgment, there remained the fact of what she had chosen to do. Not a crime, perhaps, but a silence that reshaped lives. Inside the narrow hallway of her cottage, Audrey stood before a gilt-framed photograph of her sister. It was the only one she'd kept. Margaret in profile, singing, caught mid-note, unguarded, alive. For years, Audrey had avoided looking at it too closely. Now, she studied it with painful stillness. Behind her, a letter sat on the hallway table, addressed in careful handwriting. To Miss Nora Buckley, no known address care, of Reverend Allerton, Haythorpe Parish Office. Inside was no apology, no sweeping confession. Audrey had not found words for that, only a single handwritten note folded with reverent care. Your mother was brilliant, and I was afraid of her light. I cannot undo what I buried, but I will no longer hide it. The hymnal is gone, but her voice still remains. So will yours. Audrey did not sign it. Some names were better left in the margins. At the vicarage, Reverend Allerton received the letter quietly. He didn't comment on the handwriting or the envelope. He merely placed it in the outbox with a gentle hand. Miss Marple, seated across from him at the hearth, sipped her tea. She wrote it, he said. Miss Marple nodded. She did not explain herself. She's not ready to. But she understands now that silence does not preserve, it corrodes. The vicar sighed. Will Nora ever come back? She may, said Miss Marple, or she may never need to. Sometimes the act of being heard, of being acknowledged, is enough. Meanwhile, Thomas Gray returned to his routines with a kind of quiet bravery. He said little about the days he spent hiding. When pressed, he only said it was peaceful, but there was something older in his eyes now, something that hadn't been there before. Mr. Quimby at the butcher's gave him a raise, and even Mrs. Hartnell for once offered no opinion. That was Haythorpe's way. It did not apologize, but it made room. A space at the table, a nod on the street, a second chance. For Miss Marple, the consequence was quieter still. She sat one evening by her garden, thimble in hand, repairing a loose hem on a handkerchief. The spring air had turned, crisp again, and a robin hopped along the low stone wall. She wasn't reflecting on Margaret Lembridge or even Nora Buckley, not directly, but on the nature of stories left unfinished. The hymnal had been torn apart, yes, but it had also been used to hide a truth meant to protect. That truth, like a seed, had rooted itself in the lives of those left behind. It had taken years to grow into consequence, and now that it had bloomed, it could not be unseen. Some villagers would whisper for weeks, some would try to forget, others would pretend none of it had happened at all. But Miss Marple knew better. In every village, in every tidy garden and polished teacup, lay the possibility of human weakness, and, if one looked closely enough, a fragile hope for redemption. That Sunday, a new hymnal was placed on the lectern at St. Mary Mead. It was plain, unmarked, bound in soft grey leather without ornament. Reverend Allerton read from it without comment. No mention was made of the one it replaced. But Miss Marple noticed something. The final page bore a line, written in delicate ink, not printed, but added by hand. Truth, like music, must be heard, even when the choir falls silent. She smiled. Faintly, Audrey had written it, and in that small gesture the consequence had found its shape, not in punishment or scandal, but in a whispered acknowledgment. The village would never speak of it aloud, but it would remember, in glances, in silences, in the quiet grace of second chances. And that, Miss Marple thought, was all the justice Margaret Lembridge had ever wanted. Chapter 12. The week following, the unofficial resolution of the case passed in the quiet, practical rhythm Haythorpe knew best. The market stalls resumed their usual chattering pace. The church committee met to discuss hymn replacements without touching the matter of the incident, and Miss Marple, as ever, took her daily walk around the green. But behind closed doors, the ripple effects of Margaret Lembridge's long-buried truth were still moving. On Friday morning, a letter arrived at Miss Marple's cottage. It was delivered by hand. Reverend Allerton himself, who looked unusually thoughtful when she opened the door. It came to the parish office, he said, offering the envelope, forwarded from a London address. The envelope bore no return address, but the handwriting was unmistakably familiar. Steady, tight, restrained. Nora Buckley. Miss Marple waited until the vicar had left before taking her tea and the letter to the garden. She settled beneath the budding magnolia tree and opened the envelope with delicate fingers. Inside were 2 pages. The first was short. Miss Marple, I have no words that feel quite right, but you deserve something more than silence. Thank you for protecting Thomas, for exposing the truth without cruelty, and for helping me understand that grief does not end when secrets do. It only begins. I have enclosed the last thing my mother wrote. I found it among the pages of the torn hymnal, folded behind the backboard. Audrey didn't know it was there. I think Margaret meant it to be found last. Do with it as you see fit. Nora, Miss Marple unfolded the second page. The paper was worn, the ink slightly blurred at the edges. A pressed petal, barely a wisp of violet, was tucked within the fold. Margaret's final words, written with a trembling hand. If this page is found, I am likely gone, not by force, but by choice. I have forgiven Audrey, though she may never ask for it. I wish she would. I have chosen love over fear. My child will be born with or without me. But if she returns here some day, please tell her I sang to her every night. I held her name in my mouth like a prayer. She was not a mistake. She was my hymn. Miss Marple read it once, then again. The breeze stirred the paper gently, but she didn't move to fold it away. Her eyes lingered on the signature. Margaret L. So final, so soft. That afternoon she walked once more to the church. St. Mary Mead had never looked more still. The doors were unlocked, the pews empty. She stepped inside with the familiarity of someone who knew every creak in the floorboards. Reverend Allerton was arranging hymnals on the side table when he saw her. No congregation today, I'm afraid, he said, smiling faintly. No need, she replied, and held out the letter. He read it slowly. His eyes didn't mist, but they did pause longer than usual over the final lines. Does Audrey know? She will, Miss Marple said. I think it belongs to her, but not quite yet. The vicar folded the letter carefully. "What would you like me to do with it?" Miss Marple looked around the nave. "Place it in the new hymnal, in the back cover, not hidden, just present." He hesitated only a moment, then nodded. And so Margaret Lembridge's final hymn returned to the place her voice once filled, not as a scandal, not as a memory to fear, but as the soft final chord of a song that had waited far too long to end. That evening, Audrey Lembridge walked past Miss Marple's gate. She didn't stop. She didn't look up. But Miss Marple noticed the envelope in her hand, the way her fingers tightened around it, and the fragile expression, half resolve, half dread, that marked her face. The letter had reached her, and with it the last confirmation, not of guilt, but of grace. Chapter 13. 2 weeks later, the village of Haythorpe moved with the unhurried rhythm of early April. Daffodils bloomed beside crooked fences. The scent of turned soil carried on the wind, and life resumed its delicate pattern. Tea, gossip, market days, and murmured greetings in church pews. To the casual observer, nothing had changed, but change in Haythorpe was never loud. It came like mist, clinging to door frames and garden paths, reshaping things only if one knew where to look. Audrey Lembridge had not resumed her position with the choir. She attended services, yes, but quietly, in the rear pew now, without clipboard or baton. She did not speak to many, and no one pressed her to. But on the Sunday following Margaret's final letter, she stood when the final hymn was announced. She did not lead, she simply sang. Her voice was not as strong as it once had been, but it carried none the less a clear, unflinching alto that folded gently into the choir's harmony. Miss Marple, seated near the aisle, closed her eyes as the music rose. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. Thomas Gray had returned to his work at Buckley's with a kind of newfound quiet. He no longer lingered near the church organ, and he had declined the offer to return as a page-turner for the choir rehearsals. When asked why, he simply said, "I think I prefer silence." Still, he'd begun writing. Miss Marple had noticed the poetry notebook tucked under his arm one morning, and though he tried to hide it, she had seen the small line inked on the back. Not every voice needs to echo to be heard. As for Nora Buckley, no one in Haythorpe knew where she had gone, but a letter arrived once a month to the vicar's office, always unsigned, always postmarked from a different place. Cambridge, Leeds, then Cardiff. The vicar never opened them, alone. He brought them to Miss Marple each time, reading them aloud over tea. There was something reverent in the ritual, two witnesses to something unspoken, carrying memory forward without letting it weigh too heavily. The contents were never dramatic snippets of life. A new job in a second-hand bookshop, a boarding room with too thin walls, a song she heard on a passing radio that reminded her of someone she'd never met. No apologies, but never again silence. Margaret Lembridge remained a subject the village did not formally revisit. Her name was not added to the memorial plaque, nor mentioned in the vicar's sermons. But her photo, once boxed away in the church records, was restored to the choir room wall. No plaque, no caption, just her smile, preserved behind clean glass. And though no one dared comment, Every chorister who saw it seemed to sing a little clearer that Sunday. Miss Marple sat one evening in her garden, watching the shadows stretch long across the lawn. She had not spoken of the case again, not to the vicar, not to Audrey, not even to herself in idle thought. It had resolved in the way all true stories did, not with declarations, but with quiet adjustments in the heart. There had been no great villain, only fear, pride, memory, and the ordinary tragedies born from love, unspoken too long. She pulled her shawl around her shoulders as dusk settled in. Her roses were coming in early this year. The garden hummed with gentle life. From her handbag she withdrew a folded page, Margaret's final letter, copied in her own handwriting. She slipped it between the pages of a small book of hymns she kept by the back door, not to hide, not to display, just to remember, because that, she thought, was the difference between secrets and stories. Secrets suffocated, but stories, when told with care, allowed things to breathe again. At St. Mary Mead, the choir sang once more the following week. A new piece had been added to the programme, Come Ye That Love the Lord, simple, old, unremarkable to most. But Miss Marple smiled when she heard the opening line. It had been Margaret's favourite, and now it belonged to them all.